So if the average American is getting a lot of omega-6s today, 20 to 30, roughly 20 to 30 to 1 ratio of omega-6s to omega-3s, and just a lot of polyunsaturated fat overall. A lot of this is just unknowing consumption. It's just in everything. It's hard to avoid unless you actively try to avoid it. And some of it's knowingly consumed because of the
It's heart
narrative,
healthy.
right, around this heart healthy narrative. Um, how has the fatty acid profile of the human diet changed over time? People today versus people 50 or 100 years ago versus people 100,000 years ago.
Well, 100,000 years ago, we have speculation.
Mm-hmm.
The data, the recorded data, starts in 1909 in the United States, which is when they started keeping track of these sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
And since then, the level of omega-6 has gone from, they think, 2 to 8% on average. Some people have a lot higher levels of omega-6 in the diet. So that's fourfold. The entire American diet has seen a huge shift. Well, the entire world diet, we should say, has seen a huge shift over the last 100 years from being primarily based on animal fats as the fat source to primarily based on vegetable fats as the fat source. And that's, again, as we mentioned, primarily been the result of economics. There's been what's called a nutrition transition in a lot of countries as they go from poor subsistence agriculture societies to wealthier industrial societies. There's a consistent change in diet that happens from high carbohydrate, low protein, low fat to higher protein, higher fat, and lower carbohydrate. And traditionally, in like the 1800s or prior, those fats would have come from animal sources. In the 20th century, they started primarily coming from vegetable sources.
Yeah, and it really did take off, in the 20th century. If you look at the
Yeah.
data, I did an episode with Oren Davinsky, who has a nice paper looking at how the composition of the food supply has changed since basically the late 1800s. And one of the most striking changes is this transition away from animal fats to plant fats, driven largely by industrial seed oil production.
Right, right.
Which translates to much higher polyunsaturated fat consumption at the expense of saturated fat consumption.
That's correct. Oh, and it's interesting because also when you look at that data, typically what you see is a big decline in saturated fats over the 20th century, and then a concomitant increase in polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fats, because that's typically what the fats that are in vegetable oils.
Mm-hmm. And if
And
we
the
just
monounsaturated fats are an important part of this story.
Yeah, yeah. And if we just extrapolate backwards in time and then compare that to what we can surmise ancient hunter-gatherers would have been eating, given what we think we know about their diet, and also by comparing it to what extant hunter-gatherers eat, it just sort of generally paints this picture of, okay, ancestrally, for most of human history, the fatty acid profile of the human diet for most people in most places was very different than it is today, or what it became starting in certainly by the early 1900s.
Yeah, it would have had a lot more omega-3 fats in it, and we can talk about why that is, and a lot fewer omega-6 fats. Close to its thought balance of 1 to 1.
Mm-hmm. And so let's talk about
reminder, we're at 30 to 1 or 20 to 1, so that's a big difference from 1 to 1.
Yeah, that's basically it's basically novel. At no point in human history would it likely have been anywhere close to what it is today, and started to become, roughly 100 years ago.
Correct. I mean, there's, seed oil consumption started in ancient India. It's thought around 5,000 years ago is the first evidence we have for domestication. And what's interesting is shortly after that, we see the first evidence of what we now call chronic diseases or diseases of civilization. So they seem to go hand in hand.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the omega-6s versus the omega-3s before discussing oxidation in more detail. So you've got a couple major types of polyunsaturated fatty acids, the omega-3 fatty acids, the omega-6 fatty acids. What are some of the key similarities and differences between them?
Well, as we mentioned, they tend to have, I mean, I find the easiest way to understand the different types of fats is to start with a saturated fat, right? It is saturated with hydrogen atoms, right? Every opportunity for a hydrogen atom to attach itself to this backbone structure of carbons has been taken up, right? Saturated with hydrogen. Monounsaturated means it's missing a hydrogen. Polyunsaturated means it's missing more than one hydrogen, right? Um, so, monounsaturated fats are oleic acid, commonly the one that's in the
Olive oil.
olive oil, thank you. And the polyunsaturated fats come from animal and plant sources. The plant sources tend to be short chain, right? So only 18 atoms, 18 carbon atoms. The animal sources tend to be longer than that. And as they get longer, they tend to have more and more polyunsaturated bonds,
Mhm.
or more and more double bonds, missing more and more hydrogen atoms. And this makes them progressively more fragile, right? So looking at omega-6 and omega-3, the more bonds it has, the more likely it is to oxidize because the more opportunities there is for an oxygen to come in and break that molecule apart.
Mhm.
But what's fascinating if you're a nerd like me, is that um, although you would think that there wouldn't be much of a difference between these two classes of fats, there are striking differences between them,
Mhm.
right? Especially in the types of products that are produced from them.
Yeah.
And typically, the omega-6 fats are more associated with things that cause inflammation in the body.
Yeah.
And the omega-3 fats are more associated with processes that resolve inflammation in the body.
Yeah.
So the most pro-inflammatory fat in the body is arachidonic acid,
Mhm.
which is a 20 carbon, four double bond fat on the omega-6 side of things. And that is a primary pro-inflammatory mediator in your body. Your body needs this, right? This is a
Yeah.
good thing. And it's
Yeah.
also an essential part of your developmental process, right? If a growing child is deficient in arachidonic acid, they're going to suffer all sorts of developmental deficiencies.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah. I think, one thing I like to emphasize for people is inflammation is good as long as it doesn't go haywire. You want your body to become inflamed when and where it needs to be to get rid of infections or clear out debris from tissue damage and
right,
things like that. And then you want it to shut off when the job is done. And that's
right.
actually why, in my view, the the body's expecting the sort of something close to a 1-to-1 ratio of the omega-6s and omega-3s, because although they're very similar, they're sort of literally two sides of the same coin. The omega
That's the
sixes
way to look at it.
are the
Exactly right.
precursors, yeah, to the molecules that instigate inflammation, and then the omega threes are the precursors to the ones that shut off that response. And
Right.
when they're in balance, the body is able to turn on and off inflammation in a precise and quote unquote intended manner.